We're about to see our first 4-game college football playoff weekend ever. The first round kicks off this Friday, December 20th with Indiana at Notre Dame. And not only are we going to see home playoff games for the first time, we're also going to see 2 previous playoff participants looking for their first CFP win, and we have 4 teams playing in their first ever college football playoff game.
Oh my God!
With all those firsts, there's no doubt this will be a college football weekend for the history books. But I want to look at each team that will be playing in the first round and rate their season out of 5 stars. And then I want to look at what a win or loss in the playoffs would mean for this season for the program and what it would mean for the program going forward. We're going to start with the teams that, while they would obviously like to win, aren't desperate for a win this weekend, and we're going to work our way down to the teams that absolutely need to pull off a win in the first round of the college football playoff.
I need it!
So let's start with one of the more surprising teams that made it to the playoff this year, SMU. The Mustangs were picked to finish 7th in their conference in the ACC preseason poll, but in their first year in the conference, they went undefeated in regular season conference play and only lost by 3 points to Clemson in the ACC championship game. This was well beyond anyone's expectations, and the school's obviously very happy with the direction of their football program as they signed head coach Rhett Lashlee through 2030 before the regular season ended this year. Obviously, this season can't be classified as anything other than a 5-star success for SMU. And going forward, they have a chance to become one of the premier, if not the premier program in the ACC, and maybe even the state of Texas. Upsetting Penn State would become the marquee win of this amazing season, and it would be a huge boost to those goals in the near future. Not to mention, it would set up a matchup with Boise State in which they very well may be favored in the quarterfinal and have a shot at the national semifinal. In reality, we haven't seen SMU step up to the plate in the big games. They've lost to BYU, they've lost to Clemson. They're only 2 ranked matchups this year, so it's probably unlikely that they're able to pull off this win against Penn State. Anything is possible, but it doesn't matter. It's a 5-star season either way. Anything on top would just be icing on the cake. Just keep it rolling for next year. Now, this team is the most surprising team in the playoff, Indiana. This was crazy doing research of exactly what Indiana did this season. In their first year under Kirk Cignetti, Indiana had their best season since 1967. That's right, almost 60 years since they lost the Rose Bowl to USC. They've done nothing since then. Now, this old man from the FCS who came in and turned James Madison into a power last year, brought his kids over from James Madison, and they win 11 games in the Big Ten. Whatever you want to say about their schedule, 11 games in the Big Ten. That's crazy. And while this already might be their best season in program history, a playoff win would just be the cherry on the top. So it's got to be a 5-star. And the only way that this season is not a 5-star success is if they don't hold down Kirk Cignetti after this season. It doesn't matter what it costs. You have to keep this guy around. There's not going to be any shortage of suitors. He's not getting any younger. So if you can't prove to him that he can win at Indiana, if he does make himself available, he's going to be gone. There's going to be someone that comes in and pays him and gives him the infrastructure to win. Indiana needs to hold on to Kirk Cignetti if they want to make the season worth something in the long run and build their program into a Big Ten power. And nothing can take away this magical run of videos that I've been on. We're pushing towards monetization, so make sure that you like and subscribe and be here for the journey as we continue to improve these videos and give you what you need. All right, so we move from the fun underdog surprises to kind of a weird surprise and a wild card with Clemson.
Wild card, bitches! Yeah!
And remember, this order is not about who had the best season. It's about who needs a playoff win the most. So this was a very important playoff appearance for Clemson, as unlikely as it seemed throughout the season, especially after losing by 30 points in the beginning of the season to Georgia. But what this playoff appearance does is what a lot of people have been saying over the last couple years is that college football might have passed Dabo Swinney by in the age of the NIL and especially in the age of the transfer portal. Maybe this gives validation that that's just not true. Don't get me wrong, this season is by no means a 5-star success for Clemson. I'm going to actually give it 3.5 stars even without the playoff win, but it does accomplish exactly what Clemson needs. It's their 7th playoff appearance in Dabo's 15 seasons at the helm. They have 2 national titles and 4 national championship appearances. And Dabo, he was safe without a playoff appearance. He has done for Clemson what nobody else could have done, most likely. He doesn't need to prove anything for his head coaching status, but Clemson as a program probably needs to prove that it's still the king of the ACC, especially with all the realignment, SMU coming in with a strong season, and Miami starting to rebuild. This might be exactly what they need to secure their spot at the top of the ACC. So if they can somehow pull off the biggest upset of the first round, being the 16th ranked team against the third ranked team in the country, Texas, if they can somehow pull off the upset in Texas this weekend and then get a shot at Arizona State where they have a path to get to the semifinals, it could really boost that ranking up more so than anybody in this entire ranking. I don't think that's super likely. We'll get more into the ins and outs of that when we get to Texas. Either way, they did get into the playoff. They don't need a win, but if they don't turn it around and start getting back to the Clemson of old next season, maybe there's some more questions about where this program is going. So next we're going to get into some teams that could be hurt by a first round loss. And this first team is right on the edge of that, but I think they still fit in that category, and that's the Tennessee Volunteers. Tennessee had relatively high expectations for where their program has been coming into this season, but both the AP and the coaches poll had them at 15th in the preseason ranking, so they were outside the playoff looking in. And based on that, this season has been a great success for them as they're comfortably in the playoff at number 9. Probably not that arguably, actually. They got the hardest first round draw, having to go to Ohio State and play them at the Horseshoe. Cue the Texas fans.
Hey, Patrick, what am I now?
Stupid?
They can't go in there and get their ass kicked. So Josh Heupel is in his 4th season as Vols head coach, and he's taken a classic program who was national champions back in '98, brought them back to national prominence through this season. But an early season loss at Arkansas, which some people were arguing in my last video was the worst loss of any playoff team, could have derailed their season. And they kind of got their ass kicked by Georgia when they went to play them. That loss to Arkansas probably kept them out of the SEC championship game, which if they had made it, probably would have put them above Clemson on this list of teams that don't need a win. That Arkansas loss kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. On the other hand, this year they did have a program-proving win against Alabama. They have a relatively young, if not ridiculously ugly. I mean, this Josh Heupel guy used to be a quarterback. He is the ugliest coach. He's uglier than Brian Kelly. He's uglier than Mike Leach. Rest in peace, right? He died. He's still uglier than Mike Leach, probably in his coffin. This dude is disgusting looking. But the head coach in Heupel is a great young head coach. He should be with the team for a long haul. I don't know how many programs are that much better of a job than Tennessee. They have a great freshman starting quarterback in Nico Iamaleava, I think is his name. And if they could, at the very least, go into the Horseshoe and hold their own against Ohio State, prove that they belong in the playoff, even in a tough environment, it'll say a lot about where Tennessee is headed as a program, especially with the 2 cornerstones they have in place currently. Now, if they can somehow pull off this win, I think it proves a lot of these SEC superiority complex correct. And I've realized over my last 2 videos, I thought SEC fans were the worst. Then I thought Texas fans were the worst. But holy shit, Notre Dame fans fucking suck. Not only would it be a conference-proving win, but it would put Tennessee probably near the top of the list of programs to look at over the next 5 years at the very least. And even without the win in the playoffs, this season is a 4-star success for the program. The only reason that they would be below Clemson on this list and needing more of a win, even though Clemson had a worse season by rating, is because they don't have that goodwill that the Tigers have built up under Dabo. But if Tennessee pulls this off, they are really looking at being a top program, even if they have to come see my motherfucking Ducks in the next round. So next we have the other side of that matchup. And this one is probably weird for people watching on, but I'll explain it. We got Ohio State. This year has been a snapshot of exactly what Ohio State has been under Ryan Day. No more than 2 losses in a season, always near the top of the recruiting ranks, and this is their 4th playoff appearance since he took over for the stinky finger Urban Meyer. Even when they lose, it's to the best teams, and it's almost never a blowout. The only times the Buckeyes have lost by more than 11 points under Day is the COVID year national championship when they lost to Alabama by 28, and 2 of their last 4 straight losses against Michigan have been more than 11 points. That's really the problem if you're a Buckeyes fan, right? Ryan Day has done everything to keep Ohio State as one of the 3 or 4 top programs in the country, but 4 straight losses to Michigan is starting to become unacceptable. This is one of those games that you just can't lose as a college football coach. This is one of those rivalry games where you need to keep it a rivalry. This year, against a 7-win Michigan team that lost its head coach, its starting quarterback, its starting running back, a lot of its other star players to the NFL, and lost 4 games this season by double digits, that's an especially bad game to lose. But even after all that, the Ohio State AD said that Ryan Day would absolutely be back as head coach next season. What does that mean for their first round home game against Tennessee, right? From a lot of people's perspective, I would say they would think, and before I saw those statements from the AD, I would say that Ohio State is the team that absolutely has to win their first round game. I mean, they backed into the first round game after it lost to Michigan when they should have had a chance in the Big Ten championship game to right their one wrong in the season leading up to the Michigan game. But on the other hand, they get a home game against an inexperienced Tennessee team. And if they do win this game, they will have their shot at revenge against the Ducks in what will be a 2010 Rose Bowl rematch and budding Big Ten rivalry with the Ducks. So they really should win this game and let the nation know that they're still a blue blood. They're still a top 5 program in the country. Even with a few programs on the rise, Ohio State is still the creme de la creme in a lot of conversations. But what if they don't? What changes, right? Okay, we know that Ryan Day is safe. Maybe a blowout changes that, but most likely it's not going to change. You don't make those statements and then fire people in a lot of cases, especially someone that's earned their keep as much as he has. Outside of Michigan and outside of winning a national championship, 4 CFP appearances, there are a lot of programs that have 0. There are a lot of big programs that have 1. So he's going to stick around. Recruiting-wise, they're still going to get the best talent. It's Ohio State. They're putting numerous players in the NFL every single year. Look at your favorite wide receivers. If they didn't come from Ohio State, they probably came from LSU. So we know they're still going to be doing that. They're still going to be getting huge regular season games on national television once or twice a year. If not, they're going to have the biggest game of the season, and they're still going to challenge for the Big Ten every year. So even if they lose this game, and outside perception might sour a little bit, and they might talk shit about Ryan Day, and they might be right, it's still Ohio State. And if he's not going anywhere, what does a loss change? So I say that this season is a 3-star season for Ohio State. Probably a little disappointing. Even with a loss, it probably stays as a 3-star season for Ohio State. I think the only way that they can change that ranking, and the only way that it changes is it goes up, is if they win against Tennessee and they win against the Ducks and get into the semifinal. Then they right that wrong and they prove that they're still the top team in the Big Ten. And if I'm honest, as a Ducks fan, I don't want to see Ohio State. I want to see Tennessee. Either way, it's going to be a tough thing, but this season is what it is. It's a whole different story if next year they don't win one of the big games, or if they lose to Michigan again. Then this conversation comes around and it's a lot more serious. All right, we have 3 teams left and 2 more categories. So these next 2 are a little bit more serious, but it really comes down to the matchup that they have and less about where the program is going in the next couple years. So we'll start with Notre Dame. To be clear, Notre Dame fans, I was not talking shit about your team or your program. I think that they're one of the best teams in the country. I was talking shit about the CFP rankings process. But now that all of you have been in my fucking comments for the last week, I am talking shit to you. But I'm going to give you a little bit of praise about what your program's doing. Okay, so I think yesterday, Marcus Freeman signed a 4-year extension as the head coach of the Irish, and he's coming off an 11-win season that seemed very unlikely after that early season loss to NIU, which I will stand on the hill and say is the worst loss of any playoff team. But this being Freeman's 3rd full year as Notre Dame head coach, they're in the midst of their best year yet. And aside from the Fiesta Bowl in 2021, which was Freeman's first game after taking over for Southern Belle Brian Kelly,
it's a great night to be a Tiger.
They're 2-0 in the postseason under their freshly inked head man. And an important thing about this playoff appearance is it came before LSU even sniffed the playoff under $100 million man Brian Kelly.
Go Tigers!
Who went 0-2 in the CFP as Notre Dame head coach and 0-1 in BCS title games. Never pulled off the big one. 12 years, never pulled off the big one. So just making the playoffs makes this a 4.5-star year. But this is the first team that could lose stars in the first round. Ohio State, Tennessee, they probably still stay the same. Notre Dame will lose stars if they lose this first round game. And again, the order of this video is not about who had the best regular season or best season so far. It's about who has got to win this first round playoff game the most. And there are quite a few stats that say Notre Dame is the best team in the country. Some things at the end of the season also shook out in their favor, like Ohio State dropping to Michigan, Clemson stealing the ACC. This worked out so that Notre Dame didn't have to match up against an SEC team like Alabama or Tennessee. Instead, they get a home game against Indiana, which might be the weakest team in the field. And the Hoosiers certainly shouldn't be taken lightly, but it would be a definite upset if they pulled off the win on Friday night. For a few reasons, this might be the most interesting first round matchup, mostly for what it means going forward, with it being an in-state matchup that's not a rivalry, but could be a rivalry depending on what happens with Indiana and what happens in this game. See, Cignetti came in and lit the world on fire in his first season with Indiana. And if he can lead the Hoosiers to a win and sticks around, does that start to bring up the question of who is the best program in state? That's probably too far, but it's a cool in-state Indiana state championship game at the college level, which probably has never happened. But Notre Dame is heavily favored. They should go on to face Georgia in the quarterfinals and show the world that they are the kings of Indiana and deserving of the number 5 ranking, which I don't agree with, but most of the world does. And here is the other team that needs to win their game, more so because of the matchup and less about where the program is headed in the long term, and that's Texas. Steve Sarkisian turned Texas around and has now 2 straight playoff appearances. And Steve Sarkisian turned his life around from getting fired from, I think it was USC, for being an alcoholic. So good for Steve Sarkisian. Texas probably wouldn't make it if it was just the 4 teams. I know they're the 3rd-ranked team, but 2 losses to Georgia probably kicks them out of there. They probably don't get into the playoff if it's 4 teams. But then again, they're also probably not in the SEC if they weren't going to change this to 12 teams. So it's a moot point at that point. Anyways, off the bat, this season has been a 4-star success for Texas. Just 1 loss in the regular season in their first year in the SEC, and they got another shot against Georgia, took them to overtime in that rematch in the SEC championship game. But those 4 stars are on the line in the first round, no doubt. So the Longhorns are 1-3 in the postseason under Sark, and their only win came in last year's Big 12 championship game where they dominated Oklahoma State. And they did get the easiest playoff draw by far, including the top 4 seeds. Their first round playoff game against number 16 Clemson shouldn't be much of an issue on paper. FanDuel has them as an 11.5 point favorite, and Clemson is 0-2 against the SEC this season with losses to Georgia and South Carolina. But don't forget, Clemson is the 2nd most successful program of the playoff era behind Alabama, and while it's been 5 years since they've won a playoff game, it's still Dabo on the sidelines. And it would be foolish to count them out, especially considering both teams' records in big games. I'm not a betting man, and you shouldn't be either. Don't take this clip and play it back to me when I take a FanDuel or DraftKings or whatever sponsor in the future. Just know that I need the money.
I'm all out of money!
But I'm not betting that money. However, if I was betting this game, I would take the points. But I do think Texas is going to pull it off in the end. However, if they do lose this game, I think this season has to go from, a 4-star that I ranked it at, down to a 3-star or even a 2.5-star with the loss. The reason being is they had the easiest SEC schedule. Yes, they played Georgia, but they got them at home, and all their other games were against bottom half SEC teams. And then they have the easiest playoff draw, like we mentioned, where they get to play number 16 Clemson, and if they win, they get to play number 12 Arizona State, the last 2 teams in the playoff. By the way, if they do play ASU after a home game in the first round, they will play them in the Peach Bowl, which is in Atlanta. Austin is 800 miles from Atlanta, while Tempe, the home of the Arizona State Sun Devils, is 1,600 miles from Atlanta. This is one of the reasons that I said in a video that I made a couple weeks ago that they need to make second round games home games too. I know this one gets weird because technically Texas is higher ranked than Arizona State, and there could be lots of conversations about why conference champions get the top 4 seeds. I think we're going to see it's really silly, and they might change it next year. But why would a higher ranked team end up playing what is essentially a road game in their first playoff game? All that is even more of a reason that a first round loss, while it won't derail the program, I think that Texas is on an upward trend. And whatever happens this season, they're going to keep it going. But at some point, you do have to strike while the iron's hot. It's not going to keep going forever. In your best seasons, you need to make the most of them. Here is the last team, and you probably picked it out by now, but this whole video really centers around Penn State. In all honesty, the video was originally going to be called Penn State Needs a CFP Win More Than Anybody. That is honestly the truth, but we need to look at where this program has been, and maybe where it's going. So Penn State under James Franklin gets a lot of shit for not winning big games, but let's not forget what James Franklin has done up to this point. He took over for butt-chin Bill O'Brien, who was supposed to guide Penn State through the aftermath of the Sandusky scandal. He gets the job, doesn't really do anything in 2 seasons, and then bolts for Houston, where he is a lot more successful in the NFL. Meanwhile, James Franklin came to Penn State after 2 9-win seasons at Vanderbilt, which is remarkable in its own right. And after a slow start with the Nittany Lions, they won their 4th ever Big Ten championship game in his 3rd year in 2016 and narrowly lost to USC in the Rose Bowl in a game where they gave up a 14-point fourth quarter lead. And that was one of 5 11-win seasons for Penn State under Franklin, including this one they're in this season. Penn State is also 3-2 in New Year's Six Bowls under Franklin, which we would say they don't lose all the big games. And although Joe Paterno won 2 national championship games, he went almost 30 years without one at the end. And I think it was 20 years until he won one at the beginning. So that's 50 years without a national championship. All right. And he had a child predator on his staff. So, it kind of all balances out. What James Franklin did is he came back and reestablished Penn State as a national program and brought respect to an institution that honestly should have been shut down. SMU got shut down for paying recruits. Penn State had a child predator on their staff for 20 years and covered it up. Let's just remember that. So in my mind, James Franklin has earned your respect. But let's look at those times when Penn State under Franklin has failed to push over the top and get in the playoff when they probably should have. 2016, like we talked about, the first big season in his tenure, was their best season, actually. Looking back on it, it's still their best season. But in their Big Ten opener, when they went to play against Michigan in the Big House, they lost 49-10. And just 2 weeks before that, they lost to Pitt at the Steelers Stadium. It was Heinz Field, Acrisure Stadium now. So 2 losses in their first 4 weeks of the season. And that ultimately held them back from representing the Big Ten in the playoff, despite being the conference champion. Ohio State, who they ended up beating and was their marquee win of the season, ended up representing the Big Ten in the playoff, even though they didn't even make the conference championship game. They followed that up in 2017 when they lost back-to-back games at Ohio State by 1 and at Michigan by 3, despite being favored in both of those games and being the higher-ranked team in both of those games. They finished the season with 11 wins again, after they beat Washington in the Fiesta Bowl, but 2 straight years they lost in the big games that could have had them in the playoffs. However, Franklin's 3rd and 4th years, 11 wins make those season successes, especially with that win in the New Year's Six Bowl against Washington. 2018, they have like 9 wins, kind of a down season, but 2019, they go 2-2 in November, losing at Minnesota and Ohio State. And I've got to imagine this was the most disappointing season as a Penn State fan. Heading into Minnesota undefeated, number 4 in the nation, and losing in that top 20 matchup by 5. Going home to squeak by Indiana, and then going to Ohio State and just getting handled. That's when, I'm sure as a fan, you start to question if Franklin can get over that hump, can push you into the playoff. All of these seasons, they had the eligibility to get in the playoffs. But they end up with their 3rd 11-win season in 4 years. Still no playoff appearance. Their 2nd New Year's Six Bowl win. But the games that they gotta win, when they have a chance at the big one, they just cannot seem to pull them off. 2020 and 2021 were rough years. We'll just call them the COVID years. They were rough for a lot of programs that were not the top of the top of the top. But then we come back in 2022, and Penn State is number 10, headed to the Big House to face Michigan in October. They get slaughtered yet again. They cannot even keep it close in the Big House in these years. 2 weeks later, they got handled by Ohio State at home in Beaver Stadium, over 100,000 fans, right? They end up with a Rose Bowl win. They beat Utah, another 11-win season, but they're just not breaking through the big dogs. They're consistently 2nd or 3rd in the Big Ten and losing to the top programs. They're one of the most consistent programs in the country under Franklin, but nobody's fearing that Penn State is going to become one of those top 5 teams, one of those perennial playoff teams. I don't think I even really need to say it, but last year was more of the same. Losses to Ohio State and Michigan. This time they lose the Peach Bowl against Ole Miss. So instead of 11 wins, they get 10 wins. But again, this is their 4th time that they end up top 15 at the end of the season under Franklin. It's just rinse and repeat at this point. You win the games you're supposed to win, and lose the games you really need to win to prove you're something that you're not. And this has probably been said, but I think Penn State is the team that benefits from the expansion to 12 teams for the playoffs the most. They ended up ranked 4, but I don't think, like we talked about with Texas, they're not getting in the playoff in a 4-team setup, right? The rankings were done differently this year. You can say that they were done the same. It's the same process, I think, is what Warde Manuel said. 25 teams. This ranking does not look the same as a ranking would with only 4 teams. They're not going to be ranked above Notre Dame. They're probably not going to be ranked above Boise State. They maybe won't even be ranked above Ohio State or Indiana in a year where 12 teams don't make it and all of those teams are in. It's just down to seeding. They didn't do anything remarkable. Beating Illinois at home is a nice feather in your cap and probably the reason for the ranking, but that's not really the big game you've been falling short of pulling off in the seasons prior. That game this year was against Ohio State at home, and you fell short. If they don't stumble at the end, just like we talked about Notre Dame benefiting from Ohio State stumbling, Penn State is the biggest beneficiary of Ohio State stumbling, allowing them to get back into the Big Ten championship game for the first time since 2016, only the second time in 10 years under James Franklin, and they have a big advantage playing only 2 states away from their home field in Indianapolis. Oregon had to travel across the country, and even though it was a bit of a scare at the end and the score was kind of close, Oregon really controlled that game for most of the game. Even the first drive, they went down and put it down their throats. So what was the difference? Regardless of all that, here you are, playoff participant, home playoff game, the second easiest road to the semifinals. SMU was a G5 team last year. Boise State is a G5 team this year. So these really aren't even the big games you've been failing at. These should be the ones that you could win. These are those end of the season bowl games that you need to win. And you have 2 chances to win those games and qualify for a true big one, which would be against Georgia or maybe Notre Dame or even smaller maybe Indiana in that national semifinal. As far as a ranking, 3.5 stars for Penn State this year, but with a loss, that goes to 2.5 stars, maybe 2 stars depending on what they look like in that game. There's no way, after everything we said, there's no way James Franklin is going anywhere. He's done too much for the program. He's been too consistent. You can't even really say Penn State has ever been those national programs. They've always been a good, consistent team. Joe Paterno stayed around for 60 years. I think that James Franklin's here to stay. But the question is, how many 11-win seasons can you really predict to come in the future if this team can't prove to recruit in this year of all years where they get into the playoff and they have the path to really make some noise? If you can't prove to recruits you can pull off those games, and if you can't prove to your fans and your boosters you can pull off those games, when the lights are on and there's real stakes at hand, and it's not just some bowl trophy, it's not just the Rose Bowl trophy or the Orange Bowl of oranges, but a real chance at the Crystal football on the line, what are you doing? And yes, on the Bucky Barracks channel, we only recognize the Crystal football, the best trophy in all of sports. The CFP trophy sucks. As you see, there are different stakes for all these teams in the first round. Everyone wants to come out with a win. Only 4 teams will. But for the Nittany Lions, walking out of Beaver Stadium with a loss might just be a harbinger of things to come for the program. Thanks for watching that video. I hope you liked it. Make sure that you like and subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment. We're getting some lively conversation going on down there. If you would like to watch some more videos, over here, we've got our most recent video about Notre Dame's ranking and what it means for the overall CFP ranking. Up here, we've got our biggest video yet talking about realignment and the SEC specifically. And if you just want to subscribe and you haven't yet, we got that link over here. Other than that, we'll catch you next time. See ya.